Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me now is Whitney Webb to discuss one of her recent articles that is really on the pulse of what's going on right now, in my opinion. This is something that ties all of these agendas, which I think if you're paying attention, you can see how they all tie together, but this really ties them together in one big picture. And this is in regard to essentially the predictions that have been being made in regard to 2020, but this is in regard to a group calling themselves TIP or TIP. It's an acronym we'll get into, but that they are basically predicting that Donald Trump is going to refuse to leave office, but then while leaving themselves caveats for while they'll do the same if it suits their interests. And it's just this really interesting two-party, it's almost as if they're trying to tell you what's going to happen before it happens, sort of how we saw with COVID-19 and a lot of other things. And it ties in with a lot of the work Whitney's been doing. I'll leave the explanations to her. So welcome, Whitney. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
It's always a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure our viewers are excited to have you back. Now, this is something that I think they're all very interested in, something that you and I have been talking about for quite a long time now, ties in with something you've written in the past as well. But let's start with kind of the impetus for this. And the article is entitled Bipartisan, in quotes, Washington Insider Reveal that their plan for chaos if Trump wins the election. So what first kind of grabbed your attention with this and got you writing this article in the first place?
Well, I actually saw this story or saw this group covered by the Boston Globe back in June, and I sort of had it on the back burner, wasn't sure if I was going to do an article on it or not, but I ended up deciding to do that, probably around Monday or over the weekend, decided to start digging into them. And what got my attention is that it's basically establishment Democrats like the DNC in the Clinton-Obama orbit, right? But also the PNAC neocons, right? PNAC being Project for a New American Century, who, of course, a year before 9/11 called for a new Pearl Harbor in order to usher in all of these different agendas laid out in this document called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And basically they say those policies they can't enact unless there's a new Pearl Harbor. And then, of course, 9/11 comes around. Why a bunch of the PNAC neocons are in the Bush administration, all very convenient, right? So basically having those guys predict that something is going to happen on election day, and that between election day and inauguration day will be a dark 11 weeks. That definitely got my attention, especially considering, it really got my attention because of what I've been writing about since January, which is my series on Cyber Reason came out then. Of course, they're this company that's been doing simulations of election chaos well before the coronavirus crisis and the palpable chaos that people can feel now in the American political landscape. This has been seeded by groups like Cyber Reason, but also the U.S. intelligence community since last year, and also the Department of Justice, which sort of coincided with a lot of things Cyber Reason was doing around last November or so. And then, of course, you have this group suddenly emerge after Cyber Reason stops doing their simulations around February or so. Right. And so they're basically picking up the torch, and, they're definitely a bunch of insiders. We can get into their membership and whatnot, but they're also tied to a lot of the same foundations and organizations, part of the NGO industrial complex, if you will, that are known for doing color revolutions in other countries, like 2014 in Ukraine. Also, in manipulating the State Department policy towards unrest in certain countries like Albania and other places. We can get into that. So that's basically why I started first looking at this group, because it definitely are a bunch of red flags. And when you consider, too, that these simulations, they justify them as a routine national security exercise. But if you look at the history, before 9/11, for example, around the same time the PNAC neocons were writing that document that I just mentioned, there were simulations of flying planes into the Pentagon. There were all these drills going on around 9/11 that ended up actually having to do with planes flying into buildings and all of this. And of course, they explain away 9/11 afterwards, why they couldn't stop it and whatnot, as a failure of imagination. No one would ever think that they would fly planes into buildings when they were in fact simulating those exact things. Or you have, the anthrax attacks that follow soon after, being preceded by only a couple of months by the Dark Winter exercise that, of course, we've talked about before, and I covered earlier this year pretty extensively. But also, those are just a couple of examples. There's other examples, too, of these simulations coinciding with the events they're supposed to prevent, right? But what these simulations often allow these groups to do is pre-position assets or gauge the reactions of officials, which I would argue the cyber reason simulations are about, because it's this company for free offering simulations to see how the Secret Service, the FBI, and DHS officials will react to massive cyber attacks on election day, for example. And it's being conducted by former hackers targeting nation states on behalf of Israel's Unit 8200, right? So it's just kind of interesting, the overlap there. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but that's basically why I think people need to be paying attention to this group, especially since we can see a lot of the things that they're saying are going to happen. We can see those, already emerging, basically, based on current events in the U.S.
Trust me, we love your long-winded answers. That's when you get all the best information. But it's important to note on a couple things there. One is, as you said, the history of this country in particular with drills or exercises that just become reality is unprecedented. I mean, in my opinion, it's a mathematical impossibility, but whatever, right? They could just continue to be like this incredibly complex, intricate, and then it comes exactly. I mean, look at COVID-19, right? I mean, incredible examples of foreknowledge and predictions and all of this. I also want to note that it's important to remember that Donald Trump made his own little claim about the whole, the PNAC Pearl Harbor thing, which I know you remember, where he himself said, well, it looks like, we need another 9/11 to pull the country together. That's not exactly how he said it, but that's the premise of what he said, that we would need some, that's what that did for them. It brought the country together. And now here we are. So it's just very alarming to see how that plays out. Now, I wanted to throw in, so we know that the TIP is the group, it stands for Transition Integrity Project, which is just so hilarious to me that it's always Patriot Act, and it's the opposite, integrity, and it's like they're literally outlining how they're going to make this work for themselves. But it's so clear with the way it lays out. So before we get into all the other stuff, which all those points we're going to go over, the actual breakdown of the exercise and the information they're putting out and how they're actually outlining how, Trump's going to do this and here's how we're going to respond. But then it clearly includes how, well, we'll do the same thing too, but it's because Trump bad guy, and it's like, that's supposed to be integrity. It's the same thing. So what was your take on the way it actually wrote and how contradictory it seemed?
Right. So basically, they say that they're the Transition Integrity Project, and it's all about ensuring that there is integrity in the transition project between presidential administrations. And basically, the way they set it up is they basically frame it as it being literally impossible that Trump wins re-election, and that he will lose, and then he will refuse to leave office, and there will be some sort of constitutional crisis. And they claim that they were formed to game out basically how to respond to that imminent crisis. But what's interesting, if you actually look at their document, is that they did 4 different scenarios: an ambiguous result from the election, a clear Biden win, a clear Trump win, and then a narrow Biden win. And what's interesting is that in the clear Trump win scenario, they don't let Trump basically win. Basically what they do is that they game out how the Biden campaign would do all of this honestly unprecedented, crazy stuff in order to prevent Trump from being inaugurated in January 20th of next year. And those events, if I remember correctly, it starts with basically getting 3 allied governors allied with the, that are, DNC establishment Democrats in a couple of states demanding recounts. And then they send different electors to the Electoral College that will vote for Biden, even though Trump won the Electoral College and won those states, right? Which is like super illegal. But anyway, that's just the beginning. After that, the Biden campaign then says that they won't, they demand certain structural reforms if they're going to, I have to backtrack because there's a bunch of different things that happen. Then they talk to these other governors in California, Oregon, and Washington, right? And the Biden campaign convinces them to secede from the U.S., like leave the country and form their own country, unless Trump and the Republicans agree to a series of structural reforms. And those structural reforms are giving statehood to Washington, D.C., to Puerto Rico, and also dividing California into 5 states. So basically making the country not 50 states, but 56 states, right? And then basically all of those new states, right, are Democrat majority. It ensures like a Democrat supermajority for like any sort of electoral future. It's not really a structural reform, right? And then eliminating the electoral college because Clinton had lost that in 2016, but had like won the popular vote or whatever. But it's interesting that in other scenarios where Biden wins the electoral college, they don't call for the electoral college's elimination only if Trump wins it, which is, you know, pretty hypocritical. And then, right, so if these demands like weren't enough, right, then basically they broker this event at the next session of Congress in January of next year, where Trump, where they basically agree, the House of Representatives agree to give the presidency to Biden, even though he didn't win. What? Okay, so this group is claiming that they're trying to safeguard U.S. democracy, right, from Trump not leaving office, but they're clearly, you know, those acts are clearly a danger to democracy, or, you know, the public face of democracy anyway, to a much larger extent than Trump refusing to leave the White House, for example, if he clearly loses. What they're doing is essentially, you know, gaming out here is essentially how to undermine a scenario where Trump would clearly, handily, you know, win the election, which obviously would aggravate political tensions that exist in the U.S. to extremes. I mean, Trump supporters would probably, you know, call it a coup, and potentially there could be some sort of armed resistance there. And I mean, it's honestly insane. It is a coup, yeah.
Right. I mean, that's exactly what it is ultimately. But I will get more into my opinions on whether I feel like this is more of a ploy of the two-party illusion.
Oh,
but
I think it is.
I agree. Yeah. But I definitely think that they would be right in doing so, and I think that's kind of the point, right? They should, if that actually went down the way you explained it, that is a coup. I mean, think about it, how the absurdity of losing the election and then using political pull to create a situation where then you're demanding things even though you didn't even win, to then, I mean, that's absurd, as well as the idea of
they had 4 years. If you want to believe the DNC is like, you know, wanted to, you know, that all of this is real and whatever, you know, they have 4 years to figure out how to unseat Trump, and they choose literally the worst candidate ever, the senile, basically Republican, you know, in terms of his policies that, you know, created the 94 crime bill and used to work with segregationists like Strom Thurmond, right, and and all of this stuff, and who is super close to Wall Street and has sworn his economic advisors to secrecy about his plans for the economy and all this stuff. This is the guy that the DNC chose, right? And he can't even he probably won't be able to have a debate with Trump. He can hardly talk in public, right?
Right.
And so this is like the person that they're putting out there, and now they're making plans for like if they lose, because their candidate is so freaking bad, right, that they're gonna basically do all this stuff and you know, just take totally extreme, unprecedented actions that would do the very thing this group is claiming to protect against, right? Exactly. So it's insane.
Inherent hypocrisy, which I believe is applied to every part of the two-party paradigm today. Like it's clownishly hypocritical on all of this stuff. And I want to add that one thing you included in your article is, which I found incredibly relevant, and I think, and this to me is the kind of red flag that suggests that this is intentional. Again, this could be a conspiracy theory in and of itself, but it seems like you're driving us into this divide. But that basically Hillary Clinton is one of the people making the claims that she, quote, should not concede under any circumstances. I mean, that's literally saying that we don't care about what you people vote for, which
well, she doesn't.
Exactly. As well as the fact that this, even more so, guess, and you know this because you wrote it, but guess who, for those watching, played Joe Biden during this whole thing? You want to tell us, Whitney, who played Joe Biden?
Yeah, the person that played Joe Biden in these simulations was John Podesta, who is, you know, former chief of staff to Bill Clinton during his second term, and of course was the former campaign manager for Hillary in 2016.
I mean, aside from the guy being, I would mean personally, my opinion, disgusting for a lot of reasons, you're picking someone who is openly biased politically, right? So it's just, and he's the one that's, I mean, it's just so clear how this is not meant to be legitimate or, you know,
right. Well, this bipartisan group, right? It's worth pointing out that all the Republican members are part of this Never Trumper faction, or a lot of them are members of the Lincoln Project that you've probably seen on Twitter. That is this like, Romney Republican, neocon Republican type of organization that's, part of the resistance, like Bill Kristol, who's also part of this Transition Integrity Project, like I said, the PNAC neocons. You also have Michael Chertoff, a Republican, former head of DHS, whose mom was part of Mossad, right? So, an all-around good group of guys simulating complete doom for the U.S. So I really hope people pay attention to this. It's just so crazy. It almost leaves me without words, to be honest, because it's just like, what? But
it's so clear. That's the thing that blows me away. I think you and I were just talking about this. It's so more than as long as I've been doing this, I've never seen something that's so on its face obvious that there's corruption, hypocrisy, illegal activity, and yet it's just because people are so partisan, so divided that they just don't want to see it. And I'll read one of these parts that you added here. You put also notable is the fact that in the simulation, the TIP, the group we're talking about, blamed Trump, the Trump campaign for the Democrats' decision to take the provocative, unprecedented actions. So they're even blaming him for doing things that they are claiming is unjust if Trump were to have done it, saying that he created the conditions for them to take this. I mean, again, it's this kind of unhinged perception that no matter what they do, it's just because they've decided. And think about this. It's interesting. That seems like an exact microcosm of the illogical and dishonest projections they put into foreign policy, right? Well, we're murdering people and overthrowing countries, but it's okay because we're good guy and they're bad guy. And that seems like this is the exact same thing. I mean, am I wrong?
We're protecting democracy by destroying it and all that stuff. Yeah, right. I mean, that's basically what their argument is. It's pretty crazy. But going back to Hillary Clinton's statement, right, that you mentioned, not only does she say Joe Biden should not concede under any circumstances, she says, I believe Biden will eventually win as long as we drag this out and are as relentless as the other side, right? Which is essentially what, that those policies chosen by Podesta role-playing Biden, right? That's essentially what that is. And of course, Podesta very closely tied to the Clinton family. So it's safe to say that she's aware of what those exercises involved, right? Well, also because a lot of other people tied to the DNC are part of that. Donna Brazile, for example, is also part of the TIP. And you have some other Clinton official or former people connected to Clinton. For example, one of the co-founders of the TIP is this lady named Rosa Brooks, who was an advisor to the Obama-era Pentagon, but also an advisor to the State Department when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and previously advisor to the State Department during the Clinton administration as well. But she's also an interesting character. We can get more into her in a little bit, but it's definitely worth pointing out Clinton saying this very recently. And then, because a lot of these simulations, right, they took place in June. They got some coverage in June and July. But now all of a sudden, yesterday, when this article I published came out, right, you had a story in the New York Times by David Brooks, I believe, talking about what happens if Trump won't leave office, talking about this group, right? And then you have the Washington Post also saying, what happens if Trump won't leave office? These guys are preparing and they're so great and they're going to protect democracy for us and all this stuff from the evil Trump, I mean, it's just that same narrative, but it's worth pointing out too, and we can get more into this later, that I think on the other side, I think at the end of the day, the Republicans, or rather the Trump reelection campaign, is also sort of part of the same narrative, creating election chaos. As I pointed out in my Cyber Reason series, a decent amount of overlap between Cyber Reason and powerful interests that back Trump. From SoftBank, which is Cyber Reason's top investor. They have ties to Kushner. Their head guy was close to Trump during the transition period. Of course, they're involved with Israeli intelligence, Trump and the Zionist lobby. There's a lot of connections there, right? So I definitely don't think he's, a hero here. If anything, this is sort of helping, sort of ingraining this or entrenching this narrative among Trump supporters that Trump is fighting the deep state, and here is this deep state group, which is true, right? The uniparty simulating how to unseat him. But at the same time, I mean, you have the Trump administration sort of playing into this, like with the whole post office thing.
Mm-hmm.
These simulations took place in June before that whole controversy erupted about Trump manipulating the post office to stay in power before the election. And then just a few weeks later, he's accused of doing that, right? When he could have easily, he knew these simulations were going on. The Trump administration did, because it's all these like big name guys, right? And it even gets mainstream media coverage. So why would he play into that narrative? It's almost like they're doing it on purpose. And then at the same time, you have Richard Grenell, who was appointed by Trump to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the head of the U.S. intelligence community. He came out a day or two ago saying they're not going to share election security information with Congress or make it public or share it with Democrats, or not, basically just make it opaque and not transparent about it, right? So why would they do that if they're accusing them of saying, oh, they're going to do that? It's like they're playing into it, And I think the end result, as I said last year, or as said earlier, last year, these intelligence agencies that are, and also the Department of Defense, Mark Esper, you had Bill Barr on this joint statement. We're talking about, complete chaos for the 2020 election last November, basically, right? So I definitely think this is something that's being engineered by both sides, and the end result is something, is basically what I've talked about a couple times, that I think they're basically going to try and use whatever crisis is created here to justify a new public form of government. I would argue that democracy in the U.S. is an illusion, essentially, right? And that the real government is something different. But I think the public face of government is going to change, and what the real government is, I would argue, was going to be, more public. And, a lot of these simulations predict some sort of role for the military stepping in. Right, cyber reasons simulations predicted that. So did the Transition Integrity Project, right? And in the Trump win scenario, for example, at the end of that scenario, they say, well, the role of the military is unclear. It's unclear what they would do in this situation, right? But in a couple of the other ones, they sort of hint that it would be the military stepping in to ensure integrity in the transition process, right? Which I think is really interesting when you consider that, I think a lot of the changes that, the Great Reset and all of that stuff, a lot of those changes that the elite in the U.S., economic and political elite, want to see enacted in the U.S., they know that there'll be resistance to that, and they can only use coronavirus as a justification and a disguise for those agendas for so long. So what happens when people get wise to it? Well, if the system of government is different and the military, right, are now the police, right, it's definitely easier for them to clamp down on any sort of resistance to, these Great Reset, Fourth Industrial Revolution, AI-driven agendas.
Yeah, and you could already see this being played out with the different protests and riots that are happening simultaneously, and it's being, it's being used to set that table. So once they get there, if anything, if we do resist, it's all riots all of a sudden, right? And put it down. That's why people are already floating, and they already had been Trump a long time ago, the Insurrection Act. Right, I think that's going to be pulled right before the election.
That is also in this Transition Integrity Project stuff, not in the clear Trump win scenario, but in, I think, 2 of the other ones, because there were 4 in total, and 2 of the other ones, Trump invokes the Insurrection Act.
Of course, they're telling
right
us,
after Election Day, so they're telling you, Well,
I mean, like we said in the beginning, they have been and not just, they do this. The history is unreal if you want to look into how many times they predicted things or exercises, but just with 2020. They've been telling us since 2016, over and over and over, this is what's going to happen. Martial law. It's not, somebody will refuse to leave, or somebody will meddle. Iran, China, this. They've been screaming about this forever. So they're just setting this table, like you're saying, it's just very clearly set up right now.
Right.
And I think that this tie-in, and, before we get to cyber reason, we can end with that, which is so obviously important. It's this artificial intelligence connection, which you made very clear in regard to them, foreknowledge as well, but having these plans and agendas that were tried to be forced in before this for any number of reasons that are now being applied to COVID-19, suddenly are now being applied for the same kind of idea in protecting the election and anything they can use. So one of the things you wrote about was Rosa Brooks, I think you already mentioned, but it says that she was an advisor to the Pentagon and Hillary Clinton. The part was the Open Society Foundation as well, which has ties into plenty of other things, as well as the think tank New America, which you wrote has ties to people like the Silicon Valley billionaires, Bill Gates, Eric Schmidt, and Pierre Omidyar, and on and on and on. So even there, you can see this tie-in with the people involved that has a direct tie to the agenda of AI and all that. And so would you touch on that for me first? Then we'll jump into the idea of people like Nils Gilman and all that.
Right. Well, it's sort of related. So I already talked about Rosa Brooks, right? And I talked about to a little extent about the, the ties to color revolutions in other countries. That's basically the Open Society Foundations. Also, the director of the Transition Integrity Project is a lady named Zoe Hudson, who was also involved, was basically the liaison between Open Society Foundations and the U.S. government during the Arab Spring, right? Which we know from WikiLeaks, right, that while Hillary Clinton was in charge of the State Department, he was sending her emails telling her how to respond, right? Soros was, who funds Open Society Foundations, was telling Clinton how to respond to unrest or certain events that were going on. And of course, it was later exposed from leaks of his organization that that Open Society was intimately involved in the engineered revolution or coup in 2014 in Ukraine, where Piero Midyar was also involved, right? Who's, one of these guys that funds the New America think tank, right? So it's definitely interesting to see that there. But also Rosa Brooks is interesting because she also her research interests is the blurring line between the military and the police, right? And the differences between military and domestic policing and war and crime and all of this. And she's head of one of the main people at Georgetown's program for innovative policing, right? Which includes like new technologies to be used by law enforcement, but also she has been pushing for these federal guidelines for police departments throughout the country, which is basically a stepping stone to the federalization of the police, right? Basically a federal police force instead of local police departments, centralizing, making one single police force for the whole country, which is actually something that is done in dictatorships. For example, Chile, where I live. That's how the police have been set up since Pinochet, took power. It's basically a single federal police force, right? So it's definitely not good, but it's all being done under the guise of reforming the police. And actually, the Open Society Foundations, while Rosa Brooks was working there, right, was what had this leaked document come out by DC Leaks is the group that published it, that showed that the Open Society Foundations had a meeting where they talked about how to capitalize off of the Black Lives Matter movement and basically manipulate that movement in order to push for the federalization of U.S. police, right? And given what I was just mentioning about this whole like martial law push, right, it's very interesting to see her involved there. And then, of course, you have the New America think tank, which is funded by all of these guys pushing for the fourth industrial revolution, the AI-driven technologies. One of their biggest funders, who gives like $4 million a year to this think tank, is Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, who, as I've talked about before on the show, is head of the National Security Commission on AI, right, who's in charge of, basically directing U.S. AI policy and want to implement all of these changes to U.S. society in order to, improve the types of AI algorithms produced in the U.S., right, by feeding large amounts of data into that AI to train it so that we can, either collaborate or leapfrog China in artificial intelligence, right? So that's, and other people that fund that, as you alluded to earlier, right? You have Piero Midyar, you have Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn, who's also the guy that funded the sabotage of the Iowa caucus through funding Acronym, which was one of those groups along with Shadow Inc., right, that just totally destroyed the vote counts at the Iowa caucus not that long ago, right? So interesting to see him there as well. You also have Bill Gates. You have another eBay billionaire like Piero Midyar named Jeffrey Skoll. Just basically the Silicon Valley guys, but also the State Department itself, the U.S. State Department itself funds this think tank that Rosa Brooks is a part of, right? So it's very interesting to see her involvement there. And then that sort of dovetails with the other co-founder of the group, this guy named Nils Gilman, who's the vice president of something called the Berggruen Institute, which is the institute named for Nicholas Berggruen, who's like this billionaire who's in the same camp, I guess you could say, as Eric Schmidt And the Blackstone guy who I read about recently, right, Steven Schwartzman, who want to basically collaborate with China to create this artificial intelligence, smart control grid, so they, can get in on the spoils, right, of setting the regulations and the standards and how AI is used for their benefit, as opposed to doing it against China. They want to collaborate with China, right? So Nils Gilman I forget the exact quote I use in the article, but he was quoted as the New York Times as saying that basically what he does at the Berggruen Institute is create this network, right, of economic business leaders, policy leaders, and all of these guys, right, to figure out the future of policies regarding AI, transhumanism, and gene editing. Right? So these are a lot of themes that have popped up in my work and the work of a lot of other people looking at what's going on right now over the past year, especially in relation to, the coronavirus crisis, the agendas that we've seen become rather public, since the coronavirus crisis really began. So those are the two co-founders, right? It's kind of interesting to see those two people and their connections, and why they decided to create this transition integrity project.
Yeah, the tie-in with, was particularly focusing on artificial intelligence, transhumanism, and gene editing. Like the timing of all of this is just absurd. When you look at where we are, the push that's coming out, and now this group that arguably has no real tie to what's going on with coronavirus is weirdly connected and seemingly pushing for the same transition, and it's from a different angle, which is what we're pointing out about all of these things. They're just trying to push these agendas in from whatever angle they can get. I mean, think about the point you made, I really thought was fascinating. So the idea of police, reform, regulation that ultimately ends up going to a position that's 10 times worse than what we think now. And that's exactly how Ron Paul makes that argument all the time about the way that they passed legislation. Like the Patriot Act's a good example. There's nothing patriotic about it. And it wasn't even created with the intention they sold it to us as. And we can see that now. So it's incredible to see that. And I think that really shows you the breakdown of the two-party illusion, that these people are ultimately kind of driving from different angles for the same ultimate point. Which, I mean, discussing at the end here in regard to cyber reason and this whole thing, I feel like this is all converging around the election, ties in with COVID-19, the drives that you've been talking about forever in regard to just the technocratic revolution we're witnessing, and the fact that they're all predicting the same thing. So where do you see this? Go ahead and give me your insight on how cyber reason you feel ties into this, if it does, and how you see this ultimately playing out.
Well, before cyber reason, you were talking about sort of this convergence of events, right? And it's interesting that one of the main members of the Transition Integrity Project, he's a guy named Lawrence Wilkerson, who was former chief of staff to Colin Powell and helped come up with the WMD lies and all of that. He notes also in an interview about this convenient combination of events that we have going on right now: an economic recession, protests, right, extreme partisan divisions, and concern about what's going to happen on election day and whatnot. And he says that this is how he basically compares the U.S. right now to Russia in 1917, to Iran in 1979, right? I mean, he's basically saying, this is what's going to happen. I mean, it's essentially an admission that there's some sort of, engineered revolution, right, taking place. And they're basically trying to herd people in either the left side or the right side of that, and create, they're trying to control the whole thing, basically. By playing everyone off of each other, which is why I think it's really important that people wake up to the engineered nature of both sides, the left and the right, of what's going on right now, and how, why we're all angry and mad at the left or angry and mad at the right, depending on which side you're on. These billionaires are, have big plans for everyone, right? Regardless of that whole partisan thing. And if we're mad and angry at each other, we're not paying attention to what they're doing. Right. And that's the whole point, I would argue. So, so aside from that combination of events thing, they're very cognizant of that. And of course, the economic recession, a lot of these combinations of events, they essentially created, right, through the lockdowns and the coronavirus, plandemic or whatever you want to call it, the aspects of policy that were, planned alongside, the emergence of the coronavirus crisis, or you could argue once that crisis emerged, that were put in place to sort of take advantage of that for their benefit under the guise of fighting the pandemic and whatnot. It's all worth pointing out that this combination of events that Wilkerson is referring to are also engineered, right? So anyway, where does cyber reason fit into this? Well, I think, as I said earlier, it's basically, what the Transition Integrity Project is doing is basically a continuation of what cyber reason was doing not that long ago. But cyber reason's a little different because they also predicted mass, like basically terror attacks on election day that were all conducted by cyber means, I guess you could say, cyber attacks, which is something that's also been seeded by intelligence agencies in the U.S. and also, the cyber reason is very essentially an Israeli intelligence front company. They've been predicting this stuff, for well over a year, that either Iran, China, or Russia, or all three, are going to attack the U.S. With cyber attacks on election day, attacking the heart of U.S. democracy. They have this domestic crisis plan, but they're definitely making moves to throw in a foreign actor at some point and accuse them of election meddling. You actually had Mike Pompeo go on CNN yesterday talking to Lou Dobbs, essentially saying that there's going to be some sort of conflict with China in the not too distant future, right? And he's Secretary of State, also former CIA director, right? Yeah. So, it's definitely concerning to hear that type of rhetoric. And of course, the other side, I was talking earlier about this faction of people like Eric Schmidt, right, and Steve Schwartzman and this Berggruen guy who all want to collaborate with China. But I would argue that on the other side, that's more sort of sympathetic to Trump anyway, is wants basically the U.S. to leapfrog China and aggressively try and maintain hegemony without collaborating with China, and do that to maintain global dominance, I guess you could say. So those are like the China hawks, the Committee on the Present Danger China, Steve Bannon, James Woolsey, all of those guys, and you have Mike Pompeo very often sort of promoting those types of hawkish policies with respect to China. And we've had, of course, China has been accused of hacking coronavirus research. So has Iran. But of course, a lot of those claims are very, I would say, thinly sourced, especially the claim that Iran was hacking Gilead, for example, Gilead being the pharmaceutical company that used to be run by Donald Rumsfeld. They have the antiviral drug remdesivir. Allegedly, they were hacked by Iran earlier this year, and the claim for that by the Israeli cybersecurity firm that discovered the hack that works closely with Israel's government. Oddly enough, they claimed that, the person that sent this hack, it's similar to past activities from this other Iranian hacker group, but they didn't say what those past activities were, what the other Iranian group was. So there's no way, right? You just had to take their word for it.
Just trust us.
Trust us, right? And so, they're claiming that Iran is cyber attacking or launching a cyber attack on a pharmaceutical company producing a COVID-19 drug in the middle of the pandemic, obviously to gin up this narrative that Iran is going to cyber attack the U.S. Why Iran itself has been hit by cyber attacks so hard this year, it's insane. They had 25% of their whole internet infrastructure taken out in one earlier this year. They had several acts of industrial sabotage, factories, random fires, also grain silos, food stores, right?
Israel's sabotage has all but claimed those, by the way.
I know. Right. So, it's definitely, that's another side to this whole, engineered chaos around the election that cyber reason was referring to. And of course, a lot of the companies involved in exposing the Iranian hackers are closely linked to cyber reason, or also linked to UN 8200, among other things, as are so-called deep fakes, right, which are supposed to be, we've been told, will be used in the election as foreign funded or whatever disinformation campaign to target a particular candidate, right? But it's worth pointing out that the deepfake company responsible for every viral deepfake of the past year and a half is called Canny AI, and they are funded entirely by Israel's domestic intelligence agency, Shin Bet. right? And they're
I think
partnered with Cyber Reason. So, you know, it's all very convenient, right? So, you know, a lot of times we see, you know, these intelligence agencies, like I said earlier, they pre-position assets, they plan out what they're going to do, you know, in advance. And, you know, sometimes they make those war games public because they, you know, they don't care. You know, people are like, why would they expose their plans in advance? You know, they released, you know, the Transition Integrity Project, I would argue, did this media sort of promotion of themselves, you know, because they want to look like the heroes, I think, in one example, but also gauge public reaction, you know, to what they're doing, and also seed the narrative in people's heads that Trump isn't going to leave office and there's going to be a constitutional crisis there. So they're more willing to accept it as reality when it takes place, right? Be like, oh, well, people predicted this and that's what's going on, you know, and this is how it came about and this is why it happened, because that narrative was set up in advance.
Yeah, there's a lot of power in predictive programming and getting people to think that they came up with the idea, right? That's a hugely important social engineering tactic, you know, and that's exactly what I think is happening, at least in part, is that these things are meant to seed the minds of the population, to get them ready. I mean, obviously you're going to have, you know, the people in their partisan divides who are, you know, they don't need to be convinced. They're going to be like, oh, absolutely, Trump's going to do that. But then you're going to get people in the middle that are going to be like, okay, well, that might happen, right? So you get it in their minds. And so when they put out the agenda, it's, you know, it's more expected. It feels natural. Otherwise, you know, that's what I think that ultimately boils down to.
Yeah.
I also find it really interesting, excuse me, that you have in regard, you talked about in the article who benefits. I always find that to be the most important aspect of this. You mentioned the Schmidt-led NSCAI, which is the artificial intelligence group we talked about in the past. But then you also mentioned the group talking about and that's the one in regard to essentially leapfrogging China, as you mentioned. But then you got the other group talking about working with China in the similar regard, and yet they all kind of seem to be circling around this same plan. Am I correct in seeing that?
Well, so Eric Schmidt is actually part of this group that's about collaborating with China, but he and his role at the NSCAI doesn't publicly state that. Basically, the NSCAI, National Security Commission on AI, says there's two different ways to go. It's either leapfrog or it's collaborate, right? Okay. But if you look at Eric Schmidt's associations and his AI philanthropy, as he calls it, outside of that organization, you know, he's teamed up with people like Steve Schwarzman and the Berggruen Institute and all of this stuff that are about, and Henry Kissinger, right, who is, according to Henry Kissinger, Eric Schmidt is one of his best friends now, like, not even kidding, right? So Henry Kissinger, too, is one of these guys that's all about a new order, a new world order, right? Creating sort of a global governance structure that China's leadership is apparently willing to participate in, and sort of deciding the future of the world and AI-driven technology and all of this, having those decisions be made by the economic and political elite of both the U.S. and China. So that's essentially what this group is interested in. It's worth pointing out, too, that they're also trying to court Trump. Steve Schwarzman, who's a big proponent of this approach, maybe one of the biggest proponents, honestly, of Blackstone Capital. He recently gave $3 million to the Trump reelection campaign. His main rival for Trump's favor is Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon called Steve Schwarzman his top rival for Trump's favor, and now Bannon's about to go to prison. All very convenient, right? So not that I like Bannon, right? But I definitely, as I said earlier, think there's these two factions. Yeah. The ones that want to leapfrog China, the China hawks, who I definitely, you know, who wants a war with China? I certainly don't. So don't think I support them, right? I'm just pointing out there's two factions, and they, you know, both of these factions and a lot of the national security state of the U.S. views, you know, the future of AI as being critical to the role of the U.S. in the future and everything that comes from now on. Right. So this is like a huge issue for them. And it gets a decent amount of play in mainstream media, in the sense that there's mainstream media articles that have come out more than ever before over the course of this year, trying to get people to think AI is good and to accept more of it into their lives. Right. But, you know, in terms of a national security perspective, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, Silicon Valley billionaires, especially, who have a lot of political pull, right, are acutely focused on this issue. And those are the three groups that you see in the National Security Commission on AI also, right? So, you know, it's worth pointing out that those three very powerful forces that I would argue essentially are the real government these days, because they've essentially fused and become like one giant blob, right? This is the type of things they're thinking about. Do we do it, the New World Order way, or do we do it the way that ensures U.S. hegemony forever? You
Right.
know.
For those that are, myself included, more interested in hearing you define it, could you further define what you see as these factions? You mentioned before, like the, Bill Gates, World Health Organization, and so on, and
Yeah.
would you get further define those for me? I'm interested.
Well, I would argue that's sort of like what I call in the article the collaboration faction that wants to sort of build this out with the political and economic elite of China, and then the other side is, I would argue that the China hawks, Pompeo, Bannon, the Committee on the Present Danger of China. You have like former CIA Director James Woolsey there, several PNAC neocons also on there, right? Saying that the U.S. and also a lot of people in the Pentagon too, wanting to leapfrog China, basically implementing all of this AI-driven technology in the U.S. at like breakneck speed in order to train better AI algorithms and basically do an AI arms race with China is essentially what that group wants to do. So, but I think, the adoption of AI at a breakneck speed is, I think both factions ultimately want that, because what they're fighting for is who gets to set the rules and have the power at the end of the day, right?
Sort of like the U.S. in regard to the internet today, right? That's
right.
kind of how we see it.
So like the U.S. population with either faction loses, right? I want to make that really, really clear. They don't care. Neither of them care about your opinion, right? They just care, it's like infighting among the establishment, I guess you could say, over this issue that they view as critical, and they obviously don't want the U.S. citizens voicing their opinions, because obviously they both want these technologies implemented, and those technologies mean the end of the U.S. economy as we've known it, which means the end of a lot of jobs, which of course, because of coronavirus and the lockdowns, this is part of the Great Reset. They want this to happen, right? So it's basically, an engineered collapse of the U.S. economy to then rebuild it with AI and whatnot, all very convenient, especially one thing this is kind of not, well, this is related to the point I'm making now, but not necessarily the story. But if you look at the historic wave of evictions going on in the US right now, right? Silicon Valley billionaires have been donating lots of money to house people that will soon be homeless. But a lot of that money that they're giving it to specific areas where the local leadership have agreed that the new housing for homeless will be smart homes or modular smart homes, right? So it's almost like this whole eviction crisis, this economic crisis, was engineered to sort of push people into smart cities and to push people into, a new AI-driven economy by eliminating the jobs that AI was going to eliminate anyway, but now they can blame the virus, right? And so it's not their fault.
That really seems like where all of these things kind of have been ending up, right? Where it boils down to that. I mean, think of it, universal basic incomes happening, touchless society. Right. I mean, all these things are happening now, and you're spot on, because now we go, well, it's because of COVID, right? We have to do it for your safety. And it's but the point I was kind of making with that other question before last is that I think it's incredibly obvious, and it's what you were just making there, that it's all seemingly one agenda, and maybe they differ on the implementation, but they have the same ultimate goal, and they're playing the two-party back and forth. So we think we're arguing when really, we're arguing within their, within the lines they've drawn, and so it ends up going the same way. And that's exactly what the two-party system is designed to do, not actually change anything while giving us the illusion of some kind of debate. So it's alarming that we see this happening. They're destroying our lives to implement these things, arguably. And I would say that's very, very clear, and they're clearly benefiting from doing so. So what before we get done with this, unless you have anything more you wanted to add on this article entirely, I'm sure people are interested in general, which I'm sure based on even just our discussion today, it's generally clear. But what's your take on where we are right now with COVID-19 and the implementations? And, how do you think this is going to converge with the election? I mean, what's your take on this right now? Because I'm sure people are quite interested.
Well, I think one thing that we may see that we haven't covered yet, closer as we get closer to Election Day, is also a sort of false flag bioterror attack. We had Bill Gates not that long ago in an interview basically say there's a bioterrorist attack coming, and then his wife is with him, and she's smiling and all this stuff. God, they're so weird. But aside from that, you also had remember the BARDA whistleblower from HHS, Rick Bright, he goes and gives his testimony, right? And there's a bunch of things his testimony covers, but only one phrase is covered en masse by mainstream media the day he testifies, and that's dark winter, that it's going to be a dark winter in the U.S., right? And then you have, of course, the dark winter exercise. I mean, to anyone that knows what that is, I mean, that preceded the anthrax attacks, right? And the people that participated in that had clear foreknowledge that about the anthrax attacks before they happened. And of course, that was traced to a U.S. military lab. And, the investigation was a huge cover up. And, we could go more into that later, but it's kind of a different rabbit hole. So basically, you have those things going on. You also have these seeding of narratives that, because of gene editing techniques, anyone can make a deadly virus in their garage and all this stuff. So that's something we may see too. And of course, or it's also possible that something like that is released and then is the second wave, right? Or they claim it's the second wave. And then, of course, everyone that questioned the official narrative before and the lockdowns and all of that stuff will immediately be painted as the bad guy, which I think is, part of the plan there. Because, as I was saying earlier, the way the coronavirus crisis is playing out right now, the official narrative is suffering hard, even from the CDC's own figures, especially the reevaluation, I guess you could say, of the actual number of deaths from COVID-19, being just a fraction of what, was shoved down people's throats for a long time. And so obviously using that as an excuse, it's not really going to work anymore. I mean, yeah, maybe they have, cable news and mainstream media on board and they're not covering what should honestly be a huge scandal, basically Fauci, said something like about those new numbers, about like, oh, well, you're trying to downplay it a little bit, and then mainstream media reports him as debunking the CDC's own official statistics, debunking. I mean, it's just odd. So I think, another shoe is definitely going to drop, whether it's a cyber attack blamed on another country or a bioterror attack blamed on a group. I mean, it could be any of these things because they've set up narratives. So you have to look at what, a lot before these things happen, especially false flags. I mean, they sort of tell you in advance, right? Yeah. So, these are the things that they've seeded. So, these are the things to look for. But I think because a lot more Americans than ever are questioning, the justifications for continued lockdowns and a lot of these other measures and what have you, and a lot of, other obviously shady things going on, there has to be some other sort of unifying event, as sort of what you mentioned earlier is Trump sort of saying, right, to sort of distract from all of that and herd people in a different direction away from the, the facade that's crumbling away over the official narrative regarding coronavirus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think it's never been a more important time for people to reflect on all the things that we're talking about today and just realize that lack of action, allowing this to continue forward is, I mean, all they actually require right now, at least until the election, is for you to do nothing. Right. So do something about these things, say something, speak out, write something, because this is just also, it's insultingly clear how much this is being pushed. It's all driving in the same direction. I mean, it's all the things they've been trying to push in from before. I mean, even the idea, what you mentioned, the dark winter aspect, that we can have Robert Cadleck on the news saying dark winter. We can have Robert Bright saying dark winter.
Yeah.
You just mentioned about this very article saying it's going to be a dark 9 months or whatever. I forget the exact phrase.
Yeah, dark 11 weeks. It's the word dark keeps popping up in dark winter. It's all very in your face, I think.
I agree. I think it's very clear that they want us to see it. And I mean, at the end of the day, they just want you to be fearful. If you're afraid of what's happening, they can control you. And that's what it all boils down to here. And I think what this is doing, what your article is talking about, what they're trying to show you is that this is coming. There's going to be chaos. There's going to be martial law, but it's all for your safety, right? That's what it boils down to. So just be ready for it. And we just can't allow that. So,
right. Well, I think, with a lot of the protests going on now, I think they're taking the very legitimate concerns about police brutality, racial inequity in the criminal justice system, and all of that, and trying to herd those people into pushing for policies that are ultimately going to end with the federalization of police, right? Which is something that I think, for people that are left-leaning watching this, I think you need to be, people need to be very mindful of the types of policies that are offered as a way to resolve issues with the police in the United States, right? So, be very, I would, we need to be very vigilant about solutions that are worse than the existing problem, right? Which, seems very possible. If you have a federal police force, yeah, it's very different than the local nature of police departments right now. Sure, a lot of local police departments are fabulously corrupt, but you have a federal police force and then it becomes fabulously corrupt. You have no alternative, right?
Right.
And essentially, a lot of the people that are behind this push are, they promote, this whole, like Rosa Brooks, right? The blurring line between military and police and militarization of police that really got underway beginning in the Clinton administration, for example, right? All of that is really coming home to roost. You have a lot of these policies being set up as a way to justify, clamping down on these protests and all of that stuff by DHS and a lot of these other groups. I mean, yeah, that may be targeted against, Antifa or any of these like leftist groups now, but at some point they'll also target, right-leaning groups, if there's like a mass protest against lockdowns or a mass protest against, what if the Biden campaign does do this stuff pushing, these states to secede from the US and all that stuff. Well, they'll just use the same power apparatus against those people. This type of authoritarianism doesn't really care what party you're a part of, right? So ultimately, at the end of the day, the enemy of the American people is authoritarianism. Authoritarianism can come from the left, or it can come from the right, right? So we just need to pay attention to the types of policies they're trying to, shepherd us into supporting. By manipulating legitimate grievances that they have no interest in resolving, right? So I think people need to be have that in mind for sure.
Yeah, well said. And the authoritarianism is just as restrictive regardless of which side it comes from, right? So that's
right.
the point. And I think we just need to reflect on seeing that, when the solutions being presented are essentially driving to the same thing that they say were the problem that they're making the solutions for, we need to be a little bit aware of where we are, So thank you so much for being here as always, Whitney. You know what, on this thought that I have before I forget, we should have you back on to dive deep into the anthrax story, because I think that will be a good one for people to see. But
right
thank you for being here today, and hopefully this opens some minds. Anything else you want to leave us with, Whitney?
Hopefully so. Well, one thing I did forget to mention that sort of on piggybacks on my last point and brings us back to the Transition Integrity Project. Just like less than 2 weeks after Trump was inaugurated in 2017, Rosa Brooks wrote an article in Foreign Policy where she talked about one of the possibilities for removing Trump from office before 2020 was a military coup. Right. So that's the lady leading this Transition Integrity Project and like pushing this federalization of police under the guise of reforming the police and all of this stuff, and trying to safeguard democracy through the TIP and all of this stuff, openly talked about in a Foreign Policy, the CFR's magazine, right, being like, and a military coup would actually be pretty all right as long as it takes Trump out,
Yeah, clearly unbiased.
Yeah, clearly, right? But anyway, in terms of concluding thoughts, it's a lot of stuff we just we've already touched on. People really need, if you're looking for things to do, right now in this period where mass deplatforming has yet to emerge, it's definitely coming, right? So people need to prepare for that. Number one, but definitely get this type of information out to your friends and family, not necessarily, because of censorship in the virtual world. I mean, a lot of people in your real life could benefit from this information that, it should be clear to a lot of people now, even people that don't normally like follow my work or similar work or things like that, that there's this huge push about how the election is going to be a total disaster, even from mainstream media and politicians and all of the stuff. I mean, it should be really clear to people. If you can show the engineered nature and the preparations of this going back months upon months upon months before all of this chaos emerged, just a few months ago and all of that, you have a better chance of success of when those events do take place. People are aware that there were very shady forces involved in the pre-planning of that chaos, right? So, and then if they know that before, they're less likely to be sheep herded into, the places they want people to go. And that is honestly our best chance, I would say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Incredibly important to get ahead of it, because everything they're doing is trying to manipulate us. So thank you so much for being here, Whitney. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Take out.